Hello, and welcome to the lecture on the Minority Report, The Story by Philip K. Dick. In this unit, we're going to be looking at the process of adaptation, which is changing one type of text into a different type of text. For our purposes, we're going to use the Minority Report by Philip K. Dick as an example of adaptation. We're going to start this week by looking at the story form, and then next week we'll talk about what it looks like in film form. As we begin, I want you to think back to the very first week of our course when we discussed why we study literature. I told you then that literature is closely connected to identity, and that we often study stories to learn more about ourselves and our cultures. However, as technology has progressed, fewer people tend to get these stories through books and magazines. Instead, we often hear stories told through film. Film studies is a part of the English department because film and literature are closely connected. Basically, film is another way to tell stories to people. For this unit, we will discuss both a story and its film adaptation in order to understand how story changes when it is made into a new format to be told. We will look at some narrative conventions or structures that stay the same and some that change. We will also think about what film can do for us that reading cannot, and vice versa. This week, we will begin by reading the Minority Report. Next week, we will spend most of our time comparing the movie to the story. For this week, I will ask you to think back over the semester and incorporate some of the theory and themes we have discussed. Unit 3 should provide us with some connection for the whole semester as we investigate the qualities of heroism and the modes of literature as they manifest in the Minority Report and its film adaptation. Let's start with some background. Philip K. Dick is an American author, one of the only ones that we've read this semester. Dick lived from 1928 to 1981, and during his lifetime his work was not recognized. However, since his death, many scholars have discovered his work. Even though he typically writes in the science fiction or fantasy genre or mode, he addresses many moral, social, and even political problems in his work, making his stories very complex. His work is also very frequently adapted into films. Here are some of the films that are based on books or stories by him: Blade Runner, Total Recall, The Minority Report, Screamers, Imposter, Paycheck, A Scanner Darkly, and Next. During his life, Dick suffered from nervous breakdowns and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Yet he published many books, including 44 novels and 121 short stories, because writing gave him an outlet to express his perceptions of the world. His work remains extremely popular, both in university studies and in popular reading. He is a writer that crosses the boundary from school reading to everyday reading, much like Stephen King, who is also studied in school. I do want to note now, before we turn to the text of the Minority Report, that if you've seen this movie, you will still need to read the story this week because they are quite different, and that's one of the reasons that we'll be talking about them side by side. So the story begins with John Anderton meeting his new assistant, Ed Whitwer. We quickly learn that this story will be in a type of fantasy mode when Anderton explains the theory of pre-crime, which is that precognitive mutants can see the future, and the police force uses them to stop crimes before they are committed. This theory is problematic, though, because technically no criminal ever commits a crime. The mutants see the crime in the future, so they predict it will occur. People are then arrested based on what the mutants think will happen, not what actually happens. So the criminals are technically innocent, even though they are arrested. The precogs are described on page 73 of your text, and the treatment of them introduces another moral element into the story. These precogs are technically human, but they aren't treated as such. In section 1, Anderton finds his name turn up as a future murderer, and this sets the action of the story in motion. The main conflict of the story becomes the tension between his belief in the system of pre-crime and the fact that the system is now predicting his own criminality, which he doesn't think is true. We are supposed to wonder, is the system actually broken, or is Anderton really going to murder someone? In section 2, Anderton begins wondering if he has been framed. He feels like someone on the inside of the system is trying to remove him so that the pre-crime unit can be taken over by the government. It is run independently at the beginning of the story, though they mention a system of checks and balances where the army gets copies of everything the precogs see. Since the story is told from Anderton's perspective, this puts us in his position. We only know as much information as he does, and we have to try to figure out what's happening, just like him. His paranoia and insecurity provide the narrative suspense for us. This might remind you of the limited perspective we discussed in the yellow wallpaper. On pages 81 to 82, we have a discussion about the problems of the pre-crime system. Is it really working? How many innocent people may have already been convicted? Would Anderton really be the first? This is our first real introduction to the problem of a minority report, which will be repeated by the message Anderton receives in Part 5. The existence of a majority logically implies a corresponding minority. As Anderton realizes, the three precogs rarely completely agree. Two of them will agree, creating a majority report, while the third, which may disagree, produces the minority report. This happens, we are told, because the future is not fixed. We still have free will. If two of the three precogs see a murder, everyone agrees that it will happen because they have a majority opinion. But the third vision still implies that the future contains other alternatives. In Anderton's case, we learn, the minority report is that just hearing that he would commit a murder made him not able to do so. Two precogs still showed the future in which he did murder Kaplan, but the third precog showed the future in which Anderton won't kill Kaplan because he has learned that he might. I realize this is confusing, but it might help to think of the Back to the Future movies from the 1980s. If you've seen those movies, you'll remember that the future can change based on something that happens in the past. So the minority report also suggests that if something bad can happen, we can avoid it if we know about it. This is the minority report that Anderton discovers. Anderton's discovery makes him realize that the whole system of pre-crime is broken. How many other people would not commit a crime if they were given the chance to see the future? His own case demonstrates that the system is not perfect. Anderton and his wife discuss this problem on page 90. In order for the system to continue preventing crime, it has to be shown as perfect. If Anderton's minority report becomes public, people will no longer trust that the precogs can accurately predict the future. The plot of the conspiracy comes out on page 94 when we learn that Kaplan is trying to bring down the pre-crime system. He wants to publish Anderton's minority report in order to show that the army should be in charge rather than the police. Anderton decides to support the pre-crime system, even if it means that he will have to murder someone. His decision shows that pre-crime doesn't work, but he doesn't want the army to take over. As the last full page explains, the precogs produced 3 minority reports in succession, each one showing what happened when Anderton found out about the others. In this way, the system still works, but he had to commit a murder in order to keep it that way. Overall, the story asks us to think about the problems of free will, knowledge, and control. The whole plot hinges on the Army's desire for power after it had been edged out by a newer system. This mirrors the opening of the story, when Anderton is worried about what Whitwer taking his job and edging him out. The story asks us to think about what we will do to preserve ourselves versus preserving a system. And it questions our morality. Is Anderton wrong or right to kill Kaplan? Technically, Kaplan was evil and wanted to bring the system of order and justice down. But technically, Kaplan was also right. The minority report proved that pre-crime didn't work. So we, as readers, are put in a strange moral position of having to decide whether Anderton was right or wrong to commit murder, and whether the pre-crime system should still be in place. This might remind you of the ethical dilemma of whether Gilgamesh was right to kill Humbaba. Dick leaves the story open-ended somewhat, because he doesn't tell us how to feel. Instead, he wants us to think about these ethical problems in our own society and in our own justice system. Does a justice system really work if innocent people can be convicted? But is it better to have some innocent people convicted if it means most of the guilty will also be convicted? This week we are looking at the story's meaning and structure in a more abbreviated form. Next week, after you have watched or rewatched the movie, we will expand our final discussion to look at what happens when this story is turned into a full-length film. Thanks.